Well, ladies and gentlemen, I imagine that you're wondering what you're getting yourself into. So I'll start with an introduction. My name is, according to my driver's license, well, ladies and gentlemen, I imagine that you're wondering what you're getting yourself into. So I'll start with an introduction. My name is, according to my driver's license, Michael Murphy, aka Dr. Mabuse. And I am here at the Luminary in St. Louis, Missouri, to talk about my electroniums. I want to say a word first about the production of this video, and that is that the Herding Cats artists producing these videos, and I'm very grateful to them for their interest and support of my work. And the Herding Cats Artist Collective is very grateful to the Luminary for providing us a venue to do this. They've given us a lovely spot on a beautiful sunlit November afternoon for you guys to watch a slightly unhinged old man jabbering about this little pile of madness here. This device has a name, and I named it Ed, and is very special to me for one particular reason, and that is that it takes me all the way down memory lane to the tangled underbrush at the dead end, at the very end of it, because this is the very first Electronium that I built. And for that reason, you guys are going to hear a lot more explanation and talking than I normally do in these videos, because there's a real story here. I've really agonized about how to present this device. And the reason that I agonized is that in all of the other cases, in all of the other Electroniums that I built, I had at least some idea that I'm sitting down at the workbench and I'm going to build myself an Electronium. When this device came into the world, I had no earthly idea that I was producing an Electronium. It really was a completely improvised operation, and it all started with in what I call the Summer of Love. Now, I was alive in 1967 for the Vietnam era Summer of Love, but I was only in the 6th grade then, so I missed out on most of that fun. For me, the Summer of Love was the summer of 2001. And if you take a minute and think about it, it was certainly the last summer of American innocence, considering what happened on September 11th in 2001. But this was the summer, and none of that had taken place. I was about 5 years into what I would call a heavy do-it-yourself synthesizer hobby. I was messing around with electronics, getting Radio Shack books, modifying analog synthesizers, but I was coming at it essentially as a from a conventional analog do-it-yourselfer viewpoint. And then I, via this thing that had sort of evolved out of DARPANET called the Internet, which was brand new in the late 90s, I ran into a sort of a general announcement from a fellow in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, named Grant Richter, who was producing a series of modules that he called Wired Synthesizer, W-I-A-R-D, W-I-A-R-D. And in 98, 99, I made a couple of trips to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and cutting a lot of detail out, was trading modules with Professor Richter up in Milwaukee. And we hit it off. We were born in the same year. We're the same generation. We had extremely similar interests. We're both interested in a lot of things that aren't synthesizers, and the bottom line is that a relationship started. And it grew until the summer of 2001. I decided to take a trip in July up to visit Professor Richter. Now, at the time, I was experimenting with a circuit that I called a Goldberg function generator. There is a Goldberg function generator in this device. It's the thing that's making these lights light up in a little row over here on the right side. But I was building these circuits and several versions of them, and Professor Richter had volunteered to put me up at his house so I could stay for a few days. And I decided that an appropriate bread and butter gift would be to bring him a simplified version of this circuit in a little module that he could put into his synthesizer system, and he could play with my idea. Now, the Goldberg function generator is based on a pretty simple idea. It's based on a shift register in which the two inputs, a shift register has two inputs, a data input and a clock input. And the Goldberg function generator was just me messing around with what happens if you put very unsteady square waves into both the clock and the data inputs. And it does fun stuff. I thought it was fun. They were pretty easy to build. So I built one and took it up to give to Grant in exchange for him putting me up. So I left it. So we had our visit. I left the Goldberg for him and came back home to St. Louis. Then a few weeks later, Grant phoned me and invited me to take a look on a site he had put up on the internet. And he said, I've invented a circuit that I call the Wobble bug. I want you to take a look at it. Now, at the time, Grant was very, very busy producing the wired synthesizer modules at his home. His actual production facility was his basement, and he was in business at the time with wired up to his eyeballs. So he was very, very busy. He invented the Wogglebug circuit and tried it out as a prototype and very generously published the schematic. So he told me, Doc, would you build one of these things and get the audio going and give me a phone call? I'd like to hear how it sounds when you build it. So that's what I did. And that is what is right here. I went into my workshop and I found a circuit board. And it was actually a prototype board for making computer circuits, which is why it has these fingers here along the left side. These were card edge connectors. And and this just happened to be the board that I had that had the most space on it. And so I started wiring up the Wogglebug down here in this bottom right corner here. And it's really out of the scope for this presentation for me to explain how a Wogglebug works. If you're interested in analog electronic audio, I absolutely urge you to research the Wogglebug. The schematics are up on the internet and freely available, thanks to the remarkable generosity of Grant Richter. The Wogglebug is a module that produces both inaudible control voltages in chaotic patterns. It also produces audio tones, and it does both simultaneously. So it is both a control voltage generator and an audio generator. Grant's original schematic utilized a chip that was very commonly used in modems. And those chips are called phase lock loops. And these chips have lots of outputs on them. What I noticed was that Grant did not use all of the outputs. Now, if you're into analog electronics, you're probably familiar with the name Serge Cherpnin. And you also may know that one of the things that Serge professed was that when he was developing his circuits, he always put an oscilloscope and touched every pin on every chip just to see what it was doing, just in case it was doing something interesting that he might want to use somewhere else in the circuit. Well, that's essentially what I did when I built the Wogglebug. I took my oscilloscope and started looking at every pin, and I noticed that there were outputs that were active that Grant hadn't implemented, and I think it was because Grant was simply trying to get a particular output and just overlooked the other pins. But I decided, okay, these pins are doing something useful, and they're producing patterns that are related to the output that I can hear, but not mirror images of it. And so that makes them interesting in and of themselves. And I have this circuit called a Goldberg function generator that wants two unsteady signals. And well, it just seems tailor-made that I could take some of these auxiliary outputs from the Woggle bug and use them in a cybernetic loop. That is to use them to feed back to control the Woggle bug itself. Now, so that started the Woggle bug down here, and then I added the Goldberg function generator on the circuit board up here. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to play just the Woggle bug and let you hear, if you're into analog synthesis, you probably heard a Woggle bug before, and this is a garden variety, wonderful Woggle bug sound. These are the two main controls that control the chaos. And one of the modifications that I made was that Grant optimized the sound of the phase lock loops in a way that they were optimized for audio frequencies. And I wired it so that they could drop down to sub-audio or very low audio. And because I think that's a pretty interesting sound too. And there I switched it back up into the range of the original values. So the Goldberg function generator, as I called it at the time, and the Woggle bug are kind of joined at the hip in this device. And this blue knob that I keep touching is sort of the primary conducting control. It controls the rate at which the Woggle bug does its changing. And then I wired it up so that it would broadly change parameters across the entire device. But right now, all you're hearing is the Woggle bug. And I really loved it. Just what you're hearing here was really floating my boat. And I called Grant and told him what I'd done. And he said, oh, incidentally, you know that Goldberg function generator thing that you left here? Did you know that if you introduce a little feedback and kick the frequency range up to the audio range, that it sounds pretty good as an audio generator too? And my eyebrows went a long way up because I said, no, I didn't. And that's a really clever idea. So he said, so I'm really glad you left that thing here because because it's giving me some good ideas. Have you thought about putting a filter on the output, a voltage-controlled filter? And I said, well, you know, I'm kind of early in my practice. You know, I'm not as advanced as you are, so I don't really mess with building voltage-controlled filters. And he said, oh, it's the easiest thing in the world. And he faxed me a schematic. And the schematic that he faxed me was for a voltage-controlled filter design called a Salon-key, or sometimes called a pi filter, like the Greek letter pi, because of the way the circuit worked, because of the way it looks on a schematic, with two resistive elements, you know, on a horizontal bar with two vertical capacitors to ground. It just kind of looks like the symbol pi. And he said, try that on there. So I said, well, I've got room on the board, so maybe I'll just stick it all on the same board. So when I did that, you can hear the growliness of this filter. And this that filter is barely contained wild screaming. Quite a brilliant design, and a real gift from Grant Richter again. And so now I had a filter, I had the Wogglebug, I had the Goldberg function generator, all on this circuit board, and I'm thinking, okay, well, I've got to, you know, this thing is turning into almost a little synthesizer on its own. So, you know, I need to make a panel for it. And this is the summer of 2001, and I'm not very good with sheet metal work. I'm not very good with craft. I'm not much of a craftsman, obviously, and I started to think, well, to get the prototype working, I've already had to do some stuff like mount these potentiometer controls, you know, up here on this deck, and I've been putting some of the push buttons, just soldering them straight to the board, because that was easiest to manipulate them. and I started looking at the prospect of unsoldering that and putting it on a panel. And I was just kind of like, you know, wait a minute. I don't want to work that hard. And so I said, the heck with it. I'm just gonna put the controls for the filter right on the board too. And so now I've got this circuit board with all these controls poking up, and I said, you know, I'll just, you know, when I'm sitting in performance, I'll be like this. Nobody can see it anyway. So we'll just leave it like this. And then I started to look at the fingers on the side of that board. And it occurred to me, you know, in the 70s there was a little synthesizer about this big that Paya Electronics, one of the great educators of DIY audio electronics people in the United States, made. And it was, they called it a gnome, and it had a little stylus. There was also the stylophone instrument back in the 70s that was, you played it just by putting a stylus on a strip and picking out your melody by moving the stylus up and along a strip. And I thought, well, those fingers could be interesting. And all you have to do, all a potentiometer is a big string of resistors that you're tapping. And so the stylus becomes the wiper of your potentiometer. And then I just soldered a whole bunch of resistors in between the fingers, and I had a potentiometer. And that could be used to control pitch. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm gonna just play the oscillator. So it just goes from low to high. And this controls how much of a range there is. And I can go real wide range. And now, in terms of development, I had a control mechanism. I had a keyboard, if you will, of sorts. Along the side, I had a filter. I had the woggle bug. I had the Goldberg function generator for generating complex control voltages that I could tap. And I'm starting to think to myself, this is turning into a complete voice. An instrument that is self-contained. Now, at this point, I was keeping Grant Richter apprised of what I was doing with this instrument, and he said, well, what you've got there is an electronium. And I said, an electronium? And he said, well, Raymond Scott, back in the 50s, was building synthesizers. He built a sequencer, and essentially he needed to call them something, and they hadn't ever developed the word synthesizer at the time. he said he had to call them something, and so he used the word electronium just for an electronic instrument that kind of has a voice of its own. And I thought, well, that certainly fits the bill. But at that point, Special Ed, although he hadn't acquired the name yet, was only the bottom deck here. Is only this flat part here. And so then came this box. Now, essentially, this aluminum box on the back houses an analog oscillator. And this is very typical of my process. You know, it was typical of my process in 2001 in the summer up until today. I was looking around the workshop for stuff that I could scavenge. And this box used to sit behind a Commodore 64. And if you look carefully there, you'll see that the circuit board and the box are joined in a kind of a connector down there. And that connector was originally installed because I connected it to the user port of a Commodore 64 computer. Who didn't? In those days, the Commodore 64 was do-it-yourselfer's platform. Everybody had them. They were very cheap by that point. And the user port was addressable in software, so you could control an oscillator directly. So I put an oscillator in a box with a few controls on it and used my Commodore 64 to control it. So why didn't I just leave it there? Well, to be honest, it wasn't that interesting. The Commodore, there was plenty of other things in the real synthesizer market where computers controlled oscillators, so that wasn't interesting. But I thought it would be nice to have a voice in addition to the woggle bug. So I yanked that off of the back of the Commodore 64 and then figured out how to create fingers on this side of the board where I had all this other junk piled up and joined them together. And so now I had a woggle bug, a Goldberg function generator that did complex control voltages, a keyboard of sorts, a voltage-controlled filter, and a very fleshed-out analog oscillator. The oscillator has an FM input. It has a sync input. For those of you who are into analog DIY, you probably figured out already, well, that sounds like a Curtis chip. It is. It's a CEM 3340 Curtis chip oscillator built by the late, great Doug Curtis, which was a wonderful analog oscillator, and I built the framing circuits, and they're all inside here. But it's essentially a Curtis chip 3340 on the inside. And then I decided, okay, well, now I've got a lot of power. So this is the Curtis chip oscillator. Now it's just the square wave all on its own. This is what it sounds like through the filter. It's a very fine sounding oscillator. And now just for fun, I'm going to bring the, I'm going to get the, add the woggle bug. With that combination. So now let's take a step back. So I had all of these modules. In a sense, it's, you know, you could say it was sort of a, it was a synthesizer voice of sorts, but it really wasn't designed to play the solo from Lucky Man or Happy Birthday. It was mostly dependent on the Goldberg function generator for pitch control. And I could use the keyboard to sort of start the melodies, either low or high, but the Goldberg was going to add to it. So now I had a kind of a big picture here. So I needed a scheme to mix it all together. And this is where the idea for an electronium as a synthesis of a bunch of elements sort of came together. So I'm going to move over here to a block diagram of the audio path and talk about that for a minute. What we're looking at here is a block diagram of the audio paths in ED. This is a vastly simplified diagram, but it's a copy that I actually used and taped to the front of the aluminum box in the final product to keep myself aware when I'm playing of how the signal flow, the audio signal flow works. I want to point out for people who are used to reading block diagrams that none of the control voltage paths are shown on this. And if we did show control voltage paths, it would basically look like a cobweb because there's so many circular feedback paths in the control voltages that it's just unnecessarily cluttered and you can't make sense of it. But there are two essential audio sources. There is the voltage controlled oscillator, the Curtis chip CEM3340 in the aluminum box. And there's what I've simplified here and called the woggle bug. I'm using nature's own laser pointer to highlight things here. What's in this green circle in reality is, as I mentioned before, an absolute cobweb, because the Goldberg function generator is controlling the woggle bug. There's just a ton of circular feedback inside that circle. But what comes out is basically one audio signal. I'm a color kind of guy. I keep things straight by colors. And so when we go back to a shot of special ed, you'll notice that there are little tabs on the aluminum box that are color coded. So green refers to the woggle bug signal, and you notice that everything ends up kind of in a final mixer here, which is a row of knobs across the back. And so the woggle bug is sent to the input of a voltage controlled filter. It's sent directly to the VCA. I'm going to talk about the VCA in a minute. And it's also straight into the mixer. So I can I can have all three signals up at once. Same with the VCO, it goes into all three, and then when it goes into the filter, I can send the filter through the VCA in the classic mini-moog signal chain that we all know and sort of love. But you can also listen to the filter directly without the VCA intervening. And then the final stage is a VCA that gets mixed, that can be mixed with these other signals. When I talk about a VCA in this circuit, I want to point out that I was not very good at VCAs. A VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier, essentially should be a device that acts as a voltage controlled volume knob that can turn a signal all the way off to silence and then all the way to its full volume. Well, back then I really couldn't make a proper VCA. I was using optical components, so when you had the knobs up, special ed was always making noise. And so I realized that even with the VCA all the way down, a little bit was leaking through. The VCA, I wasn't good enough at it to actually make the VCA kill the signal entirely. So I rigged up the stylus that I played the pitches with so that it would gate. And so I made it so that the stylus could just turn the output off completely or turn it on. It's a real cheat, but again, I was at that time believing that I was essentially building and playing for an audience of one. So it was good enough for me, and that's how it ended up. So if you take a look, you'll notice that these knob shafts all have like little dip molded rubber tips on them. And this is, of course, my extreme design naivety. Of course, I was cramming because I had already used up this much room, and so I had to get all of this into a very small space. So I simply put the potentiometers, left the shafts without a knob, and just put these tips on them so that I could twist them. But I could also color code them. And the problem is that, like, when we get to the VCA, I don't have potentiometers. These are switches. And when you want to talk about design naivete, you have to concede that it's really kind of hard to tell a switch from a knob there. And I always live in fear when letting other people use it, that they realize that this is a knob and not a switch, so that they don't give it, say, hey, wait a minute, it's stuck, and just push. Because I was so dumb that I actually used nylon shafts here, and if you put enough pressure on them, they'll break. Knock wood, it has not happened so far. But these are the output mixer knobs. These are the switches that route which signals will go into the VCA, and these two are the input mixer knobs for the voltage controlled filter. That block diagram that you saw is repeated here on the panel so that I can use it as a reference when I play it. Because if you think that I have this all memorized, you got another thing coming. When I haul it out of its case and perform with it, I have to sit down and relearn a little bit every time. Now, I do want to point out that my philosophy on block diagrams, because this is an improvisational construction process, I always build the device, then draw the block diagram. I don't design in the sense that that I do a block diagram even in my head first, and then build the device to the quote blueprint. That's a very fine way to work in commercial instrument design. That's probably the only way you can work. But it doesn't work for me. I, especially in the case of this device, basically just started with a donated circuit idea and started improvising in solder. And stopped when I ran out of room or thought it sounded good, and or both. Having done this, I realized that that I didn't have any room on the circuit board to put any wording or legends, and precious little room on the aluminum box to give many hints about what the controls did. And this is the first and the last time that this ever happened. But I decided, oh my God, look at this thing. You know, where's the manual? And so I did something that I've very rarely, actually never done since. And that is that I actually created a manual. And I am not a graphics guy, I'm not a visuals guy, and so the manual took me probably about as long as the device did to create. It's very tongue-in-cheek, but I did, there's a lot of humor in it, especially in these. My schematics are hilarious. Especially my schematics from 2001, but I keep them in there for comedy value, and of course, if it ever breaks. But I felt compelled to create a manual because throughout the entire construction process, I kept thinking of Grant Richter and his remarkable generosity for me in really showing me the ropes in terms of electronic design. And I thought, I really need to put this in his hands. Now, I won't tell the story in this video because the story is actually published on my website in detail, but I created the manual and found a box that all this fit in, and I decided since the summer of love was drawing to a close, and Ed was sort of the love child in an unholy union between Dr. Mabuse and Grant Richter, and I thought this device really needs to get on a plane and go see its philosophical, if not biological, father. And so I found a good, sturdy toolbox that it all fit in and packed it up after I had created the manual, and decided that I was going to ship it to Milwaukee. Now, mind you, this was created in the summer of 2001, and we all know what happened in September of 2001. And and if you're interested in all the details, the pointer to my website will be in the comments. You can get on my website and read about special ed, and this story is recounted. But in essence, I took this to a UPS shipping point and told them that I wanted to ship this to Milwaukee. Now that is, I wanted to ship this in a box to Milwaukee. So, of course, there at UPS, it goes through a little X-ray machine, you know, so they get an idea of what are in the contents. And making that very long story short, there was trouble when the UPS agent saw something that looked like this in a box being shipped. So like I say, if you're interested in the details of what happened there, you can get on my website. I will say it had a happy ending. It did eventually make it to Milwaukee and did get shipped back. And to my enormous surprise, it still works. After 21 years now, wow, I didn't think about it, but Ed is fully an adult now. But after 21 years, I have not had to make any major repairs. It still does what it does. And I'm going to see if the... oh, yeah. So I'm going to close out with just playing it a bit.